So I guess it's time, so why don't we get started? Thank you very much for coming here. So I'm Kohsuke. I'm the creator of the Jenkins project, and I'm also right now, not the CTO, Chief Scientist at CloudBees. So, ever since I created Jenkins, one of the things I kept telling around the world is how the software has become more and more critical parts of every business, right? And then that's, I think, has been clearly articulated in some of the earlier presentations that happened in this event, right? So, for example, in the US, there are companies like Airbnb or maybe Tesla, and these are fundamentally a technology companies who is using their technology power to disrupt what they thought as what the world had thought as the established businesses, and because of that, they command high valuations. They are gaining a lot of interest and tractions. So I'm sure in different fields you're feeling this kind of pressure, right? So I was at one of the talks earlier on where somebody from the insurance company was talking about, we need to reinvent the customer experience around the digital. And that's actually more norm now than the exceptions. So in some sense, I think the Jenkins just came at the right time, in the right place. So it was at the forefront of this, what I think as a digital transformation. So the Jenkins, this project, I started it in 2004. So at this point, it's going 15 years, which is a long time, right? And then despite the fact that this project has been around for so long, it still continued to grow. And I think that is one indicator that shows how this software, how every business is trying to become a real a software company. And then that's why this automation is still rising after so many years of the existence of the Jenkins project. Now, but at the same time, the Jenkins project, because Jenkins project has been around, a lot of you hopefully had some experience, encounter with using it at some point or maybe now. But what I found is too many people set that things up maybe 5 years ago and then basically using it the same way. So, but the Jenkins project, actually, we've been making a lot of changes. So what reassures me is when you look at the overall amount of workload, this is the increase. But when I just focus on a newer part of Jenkins, so this is the pipeline as opposed to freestyle, which is how we describe a newer part of the Jenkins system. You see that the newer part of Jenkins is starting to pick up a lot more. So this is to show that. So this is a great chart for me. It fills me with a joy because one of the things I've been pitching is that Jenkins is actually shifting. It's bringing a lot of new powers. And then, so in this talk, what I wanted to do is to sort of show you some of what's going on. So another place, so if this increase in the workload is one way to see this rising tide of automations, another indicator to see that is this an expanding local network of people, right? So when I talk to people using Jenkins, usually their question is not so much about whether they needed new features. It's actually more often about, I don't know how to use this software, right? People go to Google or maybe Stack Overflow, or there are some books to find out how they use Jenkins, but that knowledge is actually still spread over in the messy places. So what I find more useful is, bringing those people who are going through this journey together, and they can swap notes, including how they use Jenkins, but usually the conversation gets a little bigger pretty quickly. So in the past few years in the Jenkins project, we have took on this effort we call the Jenkins Area Meetup, in which we encourage and we work with the local event organizers that put together these meetup events. So that's been happening all over the world. I don't know if there's one in Singapore. I can't quite see. Maybe, I think. So that's been really successful. And at this point, we have 24,000 people that we can reach through this channel. So that's been amazing. Now, the other thing I wanted to say is that this, the software development industry has been shifting and evolving pretty rapidly, right? And then I'm sure you're at the forefront of that effort. Just a few years ago, this Kubernetes thing did not exist. And today, like if you don't know about it, it's like I think you've been hiding under the rocks. And that's the kind of pace of the change. So therefore, it was also necessary for the Jenkins project to keep evolving, to keep up with the ever-changing needs and demands and expectations of the users. Because I think the level of expectations given to the software like Jenkins is also rising, right? The bar is getting higher. Like people are demanding a lot more higher level of ease of use. The kind of tools that we used to tolerate maybe just 10 years ago is a whole lot lower than the level of standard that we now hold ourselves to. So, well, people here might be a little too young to remember, but I used to work with this version control system called CVS. I don't know how many people used that thing before. See, not many people. But so you didn't believe it, but this version control system, like depending on which directory you commit, it produced a different results, right? So that's a kind of crazy user interface design that back then was okay. Well, I mean, like we tolerated it, now we don't. So that's just one example of the ease of use, the higher bar. And now there's a lot more. Like, people expect a whole lower maintenance overhead when running software like this, a lot higher scalability, or faster pace of software delivery. All of these things is like creating a lot more demand or like a higher level of expectation for the Jenkins. So, this Jenkins project, it's open source project. So what we've been doing in the last few years is kind of transforming Jenkins inside out so that it comes with all the superpowers that you need in order to deliver kick-ass software that deliver value to your business. So that's what we've been really focused on, and then that's what I wanted to talk about. So talking about these transformations, one thing I found, this Jenkins project originally started really as my side hobby project, right? So for the longest years, it's been basically like a bunch of weekend developers and like people just scratching their own itches. Now, in order to drive a bigger effort, bigger project inside Jenkins, it takes more organizational effort to do it. In other words, individual people working on their own bug fixes or writing their own plugins sometimes just doesn't do enough. So as one of the founders of the CloudBees, what I'm really happy about where the CloudBees was able to do is, this company, we are the number one corporate sponsor of the Jenkins project, right? So what we do, I guess I don't want to talk too much about what we do, but we do the support, like an enterprise product. Basically, what Red Hat does to Linux, like we do to Jenkins project. Now, what that enabled us to do is to basically funnel. Not only we can help the larger enterprise take on the software like Jenkins, but use that money to fund the development. So we hire a lot of contributors to the project as employees. And they are the ones that were able to drive a big project, and including some of the ones that I'm going to talk about. So what are the superpowers that we are bringing to you? So there are 5 of those that I wanted to go through in this talk. So the first one is the Continuous Delivery Foundation. So this is the open source foundation that we launched in conjunction under the Linux Foundation, which is probably most famous for hosting Linux kernel. But lately, they've been more into the business of creating these different sub-foundations for different domains. And then so the Continuous Delivery Foundation is one of the latest that they built. We built together with them. So under these foundations, the companies who believe in the power of the continuous delivery, like the ones that's listed here, came together. And they are pooling some money to sort of foster this place that drives the continuous delivery forward. Now, obviously, I'm very happy that the CloudBees is one of the founding members, but perhaps one more point that I wanted to drive home is, you see, in some sense, right? It makes sense for vendors like us or Circle CI or IBM to be here, because in some sense, like you can say they have agenda, like say they have business to drive here. But you also notice that there are companies like Capital One or HSBC or Atos, and these companies are not in the business of selling any continuous delivery things, right? So in some sense, I think that's a great validation that these companies, in their own journey to drive digital transformation, they recognize the power of the continuous delivery. They also critically depend on this set of open source projects to do these things. So they wanted to facilitate and foster the proper open source ecosystem in here. And in that process, they also wanted to make sure that these companies, they come across as digitally savvy, the workplace that can attract great engineers. So I think, again, that's a great validation of what this Continuous Delivery Foundation is. So what is this foundation trying to do? So there are a couple of motivations, a couple of reasons that I'm really excited about it personally. So the one is, I'm at heart I'm an engineer, right? So and then probably the people that I most often talk to is also the practitioners, these engineers or technical leads in various businesses who are trying to drive this digital transformation or DevOps or continuous delivery effort in their respective organizations. Now, when I talk to them, the challenges that I discover is that some of it is technical because automation is not always easy, but more often than not, the actual challenge is to rally the rest of the bigger organizations around them, right? So in some sense, I think the DevOps and continuous delivery and automation and so on are seen as technical things. So the people who own the resources like money and time and so on, they don't necessarily understand the impact that these efforts bring to the business, right? If you look at the outcome like what the Uber or Netflix were able to do, I think the people in this room understand the business impact, the profound business impact that they can create. But that's something that needs to be explained to people in the C-suite. So it's, I as a founder of an open source project or the CTO of a vendor, there's a limit in the kind of message that we reach to. Now, in contrast, if you bring together a whole bunch of these vendors, some of them actively competing, like we are fighting, the hand over fist, when they come together and then send one message, which is that the continuous delivery drives real business value, I think it has a higher chance of meeting to the people who can unlock the resources that you guys need to drive this effort forward, right? So that's something I think the Open Source Foundation can uniquely play an important role. Another thing that I think, another thing that I'm really passionate about is, ultimately what makes the open source project strong is that it's not tied to any single vendor's fate, right? So that's why the open source is better than proprietary. So on the other hand, if you look at the landscape today, most of the open source projects are actually what I call a single vendor open source project, meaning it's only done by one company. So and that's really not healthy. And then in order to kind of fix that, there's a number of things that's needed, and maybe we get to talk about that in the panel discussion late after this one. But part of the challenge is to create the level playing field between different vendors. So the Open Source Foundation obviously plays a big role in that. And then another part is that, we are starting Continuous Delivery Foundation with these four founding projects. Texton is the Google project, formerly known as Knative Pipeline. And then there's Jenkins, Spinnaker, and Jenkins X. And then once these projects kind of come under a single big umbrella, people have this interesting effect that just because you're on the same team, you start talking to each other and working with each other. So that's the kind of thing we are trying to foster. And in doing so, we hope to create this more well-meshed open source projects that work together as opposed to try to reinvent the wheel over and over again. So that's the Continuous Delivery Foundation that we are doing. This just launched 3 months ago or so. So it's still a very young foundation. We are still building the structure and so on, but I'm really excited, and I think a lot of good things will come out of it. So that was the first superpower. The next one that I wanted to talk about is a lot more closer to what people are using today, which is the pipeline, right? So I showed some of the numbers earlier on. So this is the newer part of Jenkins that's quickly becoming the bread and butter of how people write automations or, well, the continuous delivery pipeline on top of Jenkins. So it's kind of important that we keep on the up in the game. So here we have sort of like a two-pronged approach. On one hand, we need to kind of keep making these iterative improvements, like fixing one bug at a time, or merging one pull request at a time, or basically polishing off all the rough edges in the surface. And then like a lot of the work that happened in this space is not particularly glamorous. But there's also, I think we're also looking at a more opportunity to kind of leapfrog the thing, so more transformational change that we can apply to the whole thing, and then be able to deliver like a radically different kind of value prop. So on that front, one of the things that's already happening under this umbrella of the Continuous Delivery Foundation that I described earlier is this Tecton integration, Tecton pipeline inside Jenkins X. So Tecton is, so this integration project is what I describe as an emerging, promising early phase project. So if you're using Jenkins X, you can use Tecton as a base engine. And then I'll cover Jenkins X later, so this isn't something, in some sense it's a kind of lower level plumbing details. But the result is we can take on more Kubernetes native workloads. So if your automation consists of running containers in certain order and then make stuff happen, then this would be, I think this is a great way to do so. And then it's very much consistent with past philosophy of Jenkins projects, where we supported all kinds of different workloads, whether it's a freestyle or the Maven project or metrics job type or what have you. Right? So you think of it as just another workload that we support. Yeah, I guess I already touched about this being there on the back of the Continuous Delivery Foundation. So this has been going great. Now, people using Jenkins, one of the number one, I think the challenges was how to reduce the administrative operational overhead of running Jenkins, right? So the third superpower that we are bringing to you is this thing called configuration as code. So what I want you to think about is, what if Jenkins projects actually, what if you can apply the same change configuration practice, that you use for your own software to the configuration of Jenkins itself, right? What I mean is you can write a commit, you can describe a proposed change as a Git commit, and you can create a pull request, and you can have other people review the change you're about to apply to your Jenkins configurations, and then you can deploy that into your Jenkins instance or roll them back out and so on and so forth. And I think that would be amazing. I think that would be amazing functionality, amazing peace of mind that we can bring to you. Right? Or what if Jenkins becomes stop becoming a snowflake? I'm sure if you've been using Jenkins long enough, you had this experience that you're trying to, you look at certain parts of how this automation is put together, and you see some duct tapes a wire together, maybe done by the guy who no longer works at your team, and then you step back and, okay, I guess I didn't see it. Let's move on. I'm not going to touch this because it's a little too scary to modify. Right? And then part of what makes that, so we call that the snowflake Jenkins. We know that it's not a great place to be. Another thing that really creates this the raising heartbeat level for the Jenkins administrator is this failed upgrade. So say there's a security advisory, or say you wanted to pick up a new functionality, so you upgraded Jenkins or some of these plugins, and then somehow things start to break. And you don't have time to fix this crap, right? So wouldn't it be nice if you can just roll it right back to some functioning state? So, or maybe you work for a bigger company where you have tons of different teams. So every time the new project comes up, you want it to be able to get off and up and running quickly. So you want to provide this pre-configured Jenkins instance that's already integrated with company's Active Directory or whatever. So these are the things that the Jenkins users, the administrator has been asking for years. And then what's great is now you can do that, all of those things, by basically just writing a configuration file like this. So this is a in YAML file stored in the Git repository, and you can describe pretty much everything from the plugin that you want to install to the security setting to where your Git repository is and so on and so forth. And then we are trying to build the environment where it comes with a great set of documentations, the tooling assistance to help you write and validate the changes. And then once you have this, all you have to do is basically launch a Docker container with this said configuration file, and then it will always bring up Jenkins in this right, predictable, defined state that you configure, nothing more, nothing less. So this is the effort that's done under the name Jenkins configurations code. So if you Google for it, you'll see all the more gory technical documentations, and it's been producing releases. I think this project has been going on for quite a while, but it's been released in GA since about, I think, the year or maybe a little longer at this point. So it's quite ready and stable and usable. So this is another kind of, I'm going to sidetrack a little bit, but this is another great example where the corporate contributors were able to make a big difference. So in this case, we worked with a small consulting shop in Denmark called Pragma. And then, previously, because I mentioned that a lot of people have been asking about this, right? So there has been quite a few attempts to try to tackle this space, but each of them didn't turn into a big enough effort. And you can imagine a cross-cutting effort. This kind of thing needs to span across the entire ecosystem of Jenkins. So it wasn't a small project. So what was great was between those Pragma and CloudBees, we were able to create this a critical central mass of the effort. And then once the ball starts rolling, the great thing about the open source project is that a lot of other people start to latch on, and then the snowball gets a lot bigger into a major effort. So at this point, I'm kind of feeling great that the snowball is kind of all going on its own, and then a lot of plugins are doing necessary modifications to support this and so on and so forth. So day by day, it's becoming more and more useful project. So speaking of another thing that the Jenkins administrator has been basically asking forever, now the situation that I want you to think about is, what if the Jenkins just runs for itself, right? You don't need to do any babysitting or any upkeep or any maintenance, and it just keeps on running itself. Right? You don't need to get any phone call, as a Jenkins administrator, you don't get any phone call from the angry application team on the Friday evening because they are trying to release this software, but the Jenkins is misbehaving. They need somebody's help, that's you, right? And I'm sure it has happened to many people. Now, what if you don't have to do that? Because Jenkins becomes far more resilient and just keeps on running by itself. Or what if you don't have to do any of the capacity planning or the compute cluster sizing or any of that crap, right? So what often happens, I saw in many places, is as the demand for Jenkins becomes bigger and more mission critical, or you have to have this tooling, or we have to have this much capacity in the cluster, or this much storage, and all that stuff needs a lot of work and maintenance, right? What if you can just deploy Jenkins in the simplest, stupidest possible way, and then you just keep on adding more and more workload, and then so long as you have big enough, a check to pay to Amazon or Google or something, you just automatically consume all these cloud resources, and you just keep on adding workload, and it just keep behaving the same, right? That's the kind of a scalable applications that's what the scalable application really is. Now, back when we created Jenkins, the level of the scalability requirements was actually maybe an order or two smaller than what the people demand now. Now, if you think about the entire HSBC, let's say, as an example, they have the tens of thousands of engineers. If they wanted to throw the entire workload of Jenkins, a workload onto single Jenkins, we just didn't design it that way. So it's probably not a good place to be. So now those are real problems. So what we are working on is So these are the motivations, and these are changes in the time that led us to this effort that we call the Cloud Native Jenkins. So really what we are trying to do is to, one, remove this dependency to the single file system as a storage system. Back then this was okay. This is simply not the kind of thing that the people writing application do today. So we need to change this. The other part is obviously to remove the single process the architecture, which is naturally a single point of failure. So in other words, we are trying to turn Jenkins into a properly distributed, scalable applications. So some of these efforts, so this is, as you can imagine, this is a pretty ambitious project. So it's more of a journey than this is like a project that gets done. But some of the work is already well underway, so this kind of gets a little bit technical, but one of the first batches of the feature that we delivered is around artifacts archiving, or these build logins. So in the cloud world, there are dedicated purpose-built solutions for these things, like a Voxxed Days like S3, or the log services like CloudWatch. So these are the first generation of services. And then, even though in some sense, in the grand scheme of this journey that we have to take on, this is a pretty simple beginning, but it's designed to sort of cut this biggest chunk of the storage demands today, because it's usually your artifacts and this a build log that it produces, and you didn't believe how many people are just spewing stuff into logs that they're going to never read, so it's kind of crazy, but that's how people do things. And then just by removing those two things away, we can already substantially cut your storage cost, because this read-write file system on cloud is far more expensive than this block storage. So there's a tremendous cost cutting, and also better scalability, because again, this block storage is far more scalable. So in order to drive this project forward, Jenkins project started doing this thing called special interest group. So we built this new cloud native special interest group. So this is where the people who are interested in driving this project come together and meet regularly and try to push the ball forward. So some of the work that has already happened in this SIG includes, for example, this Jenkins distribution flavor of Jenkins that runs very well on the Google Cloud Platform. So, I mentioned in the part about the Continuous Delivery Foundation that one of the effects of having these neutral playing ground is it makes it easier for other organized contributors to come on board. So when we built the SIG, the Google has this team called the Graphite team. They are dedicated to make sure that the ecosystem software like Jenkins or a number of other tools run well on GCP. So these are the guys, so they came to the SIG and then they implemented features like, this all support so that the Jenkins itself can talk to the GCP API without a complicated the authentication stuff, or the preemptive flag, which is their version, their ways of saying Amazon, it's their equivalent of Amazon, the spot instances. So it's a cheaper way of running workload. So these features were done through this special interest group. And a similar effort was done by the Microsoft group that's based in China to drive the Azure integrations. And then lately I saw, I think this one came from a European company, I forgot the name, but they built this Jenkins Kubernetes operator. So, and then they were able to, what was I trying to say? Yeah. So the Kubernetes operator is about making the operational procedures around running Jenkins easier. So that's the kind of thing that's already happening in a cloud native SIG. So the last, and then the superpower that we are bringing is perhaps the most exciting, and then so that's why I kind of put it to the end, and it's called Jenkins X. And this has been a major focus of our effort in the past year or so. So unless you've been hiding under the rocks, you must have heard this Kubernetes, right? So it's what I think is really like a new operating system for the cloud. And there's a lot to like about it. That for example, it's a common platform that abstracts away different cloud providers, so it brings in the vendor neutrality and so on. And there's a lot of obvious good functionalities, but perhaps like a closest to my heart is this notion that when you look at the Kubernetes, you see this extensibility mechanism built in. So what that allows is like a people in the ecosystem to build and create interesting stuff on top of it, and it creates a very vibrant ecosystem. And then so that's what's exactly going on in the Kubernetes. I was in the Barcelona 2 weeks ago attending KubeCon, and then you can see like there's just so much energy in the room, people trying to build interesting stuff on top of it. Now, so I know that a lot of application development team is kind of pausing and trying to figure out how to use these latest innovations, supposedly designed to make you more productive, to how do you use that and then so that you can develop applications faster, right? And as a technologist, I know that feeling, which is, it could be great fun. It's a little bit like opening up, like rolling up your sleeves and opening up the bonnet of a car and then try to start tinkering. And then there's a lot of tinkering that actually needs to be done in order to use Kubernetes pretty well. So if you have installed and Kubernetes are tried to operationalize, by which I mean things like a proper upgrade and so on, you know that it's already pretty like non-trivial work right there, right? And then not only that, you have to survey the ecosystem because there's a new project on top of Kubernetes that's popping up like every day, right? Like you talked about this, I think somebody was talking about the service mesh stuff. How many of you know inside about that? Istio, there's a Linkerd, there's all these projects that's like, so how do you know which one needs to be looked at? And which one needs to be combined in what form in order to help you do what you want to do, right? Well, obviously you have to move your app to containers if you haven't done so, and maybe you also need to split your big thing into the microservices, right? That's more thing to do. And then you also have to figure out how to deploy containers. You might have heard about the Helm. What about the pod, pod definitions, like all that, different ways of defining, delivering the apps, cloud native app bundle, anyone, right? And then you also have to automate, build up all the wiring of automation so that the commit that's happening here becomes like a production workload over there. So all of that is a tremendous amount of work. And then all of that is supposed to be just a means to the end, which is to write your applications. And then even if you manage to put things together, you always wonder, okay, I built something that works for me, but am I doing it wrong? Like, am I missing out something that I should know? How other people are doing it? There's this perpetual sense of unease. So that's why we built Jenkins X. The way I see it, instead of, I think you'd be much better off, instead of trying to tinker all these things and understand what's going on and build your own platform on top of it, you should let us, the open source projects like Jenkins, to take care of that for you. Right? So the vision of Jenkins X is really to figure out the best practices of how to continuously deliver cloud-native applications. And when I say the continuous delivery, I don't just mean the building testing, but really the entire spectrum of software development, from the code review to the development environment, to running tests, to QA, to pre-production, and how do you promote the binary? It's the entire thing, right? And then so in order to achieve that best practices, those people in the Jenkins project that live and breathe this ecosystem, put together the right software from this ecosystem and then integrate them behind the pleasant, the command line interface, so that you don't have to know too much about Kubernetes or these different tools and services that we are using underneath. We let you speak in a higher level concept that you already understand, right? Because, for example, pretty much every software development team that I visit have multiple environments that runs different versions of the applications, and usually it's kind of like a waterfall that the newer version would start in the dev environment and the QA and so on and so forth until it hits productions, right? So those concepts don't really change just because you have Kubernetes. What changes is what API or what tool do you use to build those environments, or move the application from one environment to another, and so on and so forth. So what the Jenkins X does is like it hides all these things behind you, and then you can talk in this higher level concept like promotion. And then in order to like make you productive, it is opinionated about how you do things, right? So this isn't a blank canvas where you can build your own CD pipeline. Like we give you what we think is the best. And then by doing that, like it can make you instantly productive. And then it basically puts Kubernetes to where it belongs, which is a means to the end. So one of the things that the people would worry about when we talked about being opinionated is, well, our company is unique. Like, what if like things that you're doing doesn't really match with what we need? So the great thing about the Jenkins X, in some sense, is this: when you actually use it, well, in some sense it's like a surprisingly new, right? It's Kubernetes, all the cool stuff. But at the same time, when you pick that up, you feel surprisingly like boring, maybe a bit strong word, but there's nothing new in some sense. Like it's all made out of things that you already knew or heard of. Like nothing new has really been invented. So the best practices that we preach is hopefully something you all heard of, right? This idea like, okay, like we should be using cloud to do as much as possible, not your laptop, and then promoting apps between different environments, right? That shouldn't be news to you. GitOps, right? This, again, you should have been hearing about this for years. So basically, I think collectively, our industry has been discovering these best practices in the past decade or so, long before these cloud-native things come. So all we are doing is actually just combining these best practices and mapping them into the tools that has recently came into being in the past few years of the cloud-native trend, and then packaging it up as Jenkins. I mean, these are the convenient software that you can use. So in some sense, one way to explain the difference between Jenkins and Jenkins X is that the Jenkins, historically, I think of it as this vast, expanding like a road network that spans the entire continent, right? So whether you're building a mobile applications or embedded apps or like a video games for a PlayStation, different companies are trying to build different apps. They're also at a different point of the journey in terms of maturity. So the great thing about the Jenkins is it's kind of like a car that you can drive. So wherever you are and wherever you're trying to go, this car can take you. And you're in the driving seat, and you just need to turn at the right places. And the journey is never really straight, so like you might miss the turn a few times, but there's always a way to get to your destination. That incredible flexibility has always been Jenkins, and that has served us pretty well. But what we are trying to do with Jenkins X is, on top of this like a road network, we are trying to build this high-speed rail network, perhaps. Right? So there is certain very, very common destination that everyone is trying to go, which is like this cloud-native web application. So we built a rail toward that city, and all you have to do is to show up to the train station. You don't need to know exactly where it is, and then the train would come here, and then you'd hop on, and then it will provide a very smooth ride in no time to get to your destination without you ever worrying about like steering the handle or staying awake during the process. So in many ways, it's kind of like a complementary thing. So that's how I try to explain Jenkins and Jenkins X. Now, this notion of, the way I describe Jenkins X might have come across a little bit abstract. So let me give you a concrete example of like how this thing actually works, right? So let's assume like you have an empty laptop, like there's nothing in it. So the first thing you need to do is to install Jenkins X, right? So the Jenkins X is really essentially just a command line tool. So if you're running a Mac, you could do like a brew install JX, and then you run this one command, JX create cluster, and then it's a little bit of dialogue that's going to happen, but it guides you through the process of setting up initial, the Kubernetes cluster and deploy the necessary tools. So just by running these three commands, what you get is all the necessary tools and services installed on your Kubernetes cluster and also on your laptop, and pre-configured properly and wired together, right? And then you already get the staging and production environments out of the box, and those are the ones that all the apps that are going to get onboarded will go through. So that's the basically one-time setup. Now, it's kind of not very interesting if you don't actually have apps. So let's bring in some apps. So here, you can do one or the two things. So you can either create a brand new project. So like a JX create Spring, what it does is it gives you this initial skeleton app, source code, and the necessary build script, and a pipeline definition, and Docker file, and like a Helm chart, and all the rest of the stuff. Or you can just run the JX import command on the existing repository, and then it just generates those additional files. So either case, the end result is that you get this like a source code, you get the wiring for the building and deploying and doing other continuous delivery stuff. And all the backend services configured for you. So it can even create like a repository on the GitHub for you. And then we'll make sure that when the commits, when the new commits gets pushed into the repository, the right automation would pick up. Those wiring, I mean, in some sense it's not hard, but those are the tedious thing that previously you have to work out on your own, right? That's what the Jenkins X will automate for you. And then it creates this initial release. So we are trying to preach continuous delivery here. So the master branch should be always releasable, and then the new version of the app should be automatically getting created and deployed and in small increments. So we create the small initial release and run them on the staging environment. And then all of that happens automatically just by running that one command. So again, that's a kind of productivity boost. Hopefully it makes sense what I'm trying to tell here, which is, when we can wire things together, we can make a lot of things happen behind the scene without you thinking about. So those are the examples. So now you have the app on the system, so let's work on the change. So this part really doesn't change. Like you're going to use your own IDE or text editor to check out the source code and make the changes, and you're going to create a new commit, and you create a pull request to propose the change to the team, right? So this, hopefully, you are already doing it. So we are not touching any of that. What changes is what happens as a result of it, right? So when you create a PR, it gets automatically built and tested, again, without you doing any wiring. Not only that, it gets deployed into a PR-specific preview environment. So you not only get to see the code changes, but you can also actually interact with the application that's being reviewed. So your designers or product owners can come in and interact with the app if they wanted to. And then when you merge the change by pressing the button on the GitHub, then it creates the change lands to the master. This master gets built and tested again, and then new release gets created out of that new commit with the change log that came from commit messages, and then this new release gets automatically deployed to the staging. Again, those are the kind of automation that implements the proper workflow that automatically happens. And then when the time comes, and then I guess I didn't mention this, but because this is a GitOps, we are not just deploying these changes, right? So there's a repository that captures exactly what version of what application is running in what environment at any given point. So when I say new version of the app gets deployed into the dev environment, what happens is this Git state repository gets a new commit and updated. So it does a lot more than, I guess, what I wrote in that slide. So in some environments, you can automatically promote like that. In some other environments, you can configure this more manually, right? So say if it comes time to release the bits into production, you can run command like JX promote, and then what that is trying to say is take the current applications version 003 and run it in production. And it checks out the same Git state repository, makes the one-line change to the YAML file that specifies what version is running, and it gets created as a PR. And then also it's tested and whatnot. And the operations people, depending on how you set up the segregation duties, operations people can come into this pull request on the production repository and then press the merge button to approve this deployment, and then the rest of the automation kicks in, and pretty soon this new version appears in production. So that's the kind of things, all the wiring that the Jenkins X makes happen when you as a developer, you only need to do that one command, right? So those are the superpowers that we've been working on. So it's the continuous delivery foundations, the pipeline, the configurations code, Cloud Native Jenkins and Jenkins X. And the great thing about it is these 5 things, like in some sense, because Jenkins is an open source project, like it has grown organically, but they are starting to fit together really well, right? So Jenkins X is using some of these Cloud Native Jenkins features. Continuous delivery foundation is enabling this collaboration for the pipeline, and so on and so forth. And collectively, these efforts are really like transforming Jenkins into something new. So for the longest time, people thought of Jenkins as core and just a bunch of plugins that you assemble plugins together to create your own custom flavor of Jenkins, right? But in this new world, I think Jenkins is becoming a lot bigger than this just piece of code. Like it's becoming a place to, the best practices for doing continuous delivery on the Kubernetes, for example. So I think it's really the amazing time for the Jenkins project in terms of the amount of innovation that's going on. But at the same time, this is also a pretty ambitious goals. These are big projects that needs this constant engagement from the users. So part of the reason I'm standing here talking about these efforts is because we are building these things to help you, right? But you gotta help us help you. In other words, like we never know if you're building the right thing, and we really need to be hearing from you guys. So, I hope some of these things that I showed you today, it's going to get you excited. I'd love to have you kick the tires, start using these superpowers, and tell us how it helped or it didn't help, right? And that really drives our next set of development. So, on that note, I think I ran out of the time already. So, I guess that brings me to Q&A, perhaps. Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take. So the question was there any plan for blue ocean? So I believe, let's see. So I think, what I do know is that the team is looking at like what to do in the next journey. I think I think it's currently like it's being maintained, but it's not really getting like an active development beyond that. And my understanding of that is it's in part reflecting like what its role is. So for example, like if you look at the Jenkins X, you see that a lot of the user interface is either in the CLI or in the GitHub's pull request, right? So in that world, I think maybe like perhaps this user interface that the blue ocean thought might be less important than perhaps we made it to be. So I think those are the kind of like soul-searching conversation that the team seems to be having at the moment. So that's what I know at the moment. Yeah. So the question is Jenkins X tightly coupled to Kubernetes, or does it run on other things like Mesos? It is tightly coupled to Kubernetes. In two sense, actually, let me clarify that a little. So there are two sides to it. One is Jenkins X is designed to run on Kubernetes. And then the other part is like Jenkins X is for developing Kubernetes apps, right? So now the former, I think, is pretty. I think the feeling in the community and the people driving this project is like Kubernetes has won. So there's really no point in trying to help people run this on Mesos or Docker Swarm or whatever. So I'm sensing basically zero interest on that front. The other side of helping people write other kind of apps, that is actually more interesting to many people. So for example, Jenkins X is using Jenkins X to build and release itself, but the Jenkins X is not a cloud-native web application, right? It's a CLI and number of stuff. So I think the people are trying to extend Jenkins X into like writing a serverless app or maybe even mobile app and so on and so forth. So that might become a little more interesting in the future. But right now, it's pretty strongly tied to Kubernetes on every front. All right, any? So the question was like, what kind of work is going on to decouple Jenkins from the file system, right? So let's see. So some of this is like the additional APIs that we create inside Jenkins. So that, for example, artifact archiving and then the logs, those are basically like API we built inside Jenkins. And then you can install a plugin that instead of write to a file system, you can write to S3. So that's like one of the efforts that's going on. The other thing that's going on is actually if you look at the configurations code and the Job DSL plugin and some other efforts of trying to define the configuration as a text file, it actually in some sense eliminates the need to store these like a persisted job configuration or system configuration as XML files into the file system. So that's, in some sense, I consider that as a part of this effort as well. And then the more ambitious part is to actually store the build records, like what happened in your build. And then I think that's the one that gets really more interesting, but I don't think we got to that point yet. So it's basically, yeah, so I don't know if that answered the questions, but that's kind of what we've been working on. All right. Yes, if nothing else, then thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show.